Hi everyone, it's Lauren and I'm here finally with my best books that I read last year in 2018. This is my favourite kind of video to film, my favourite kind of video to watch, so I just can't wait because it's all good things, no bad reviews. And as always, all of the books that I talk about will be linked in the description box below if you'd like to check them out for yourself, which I really hope you do, and you should. So I had to look back at the video that I filmed in June last year, which was a best reads of the year so far kind of roundup, and 4 of those books have remained on this list. So I'm going to try and go through those books quite quickly so we can spend more time on the books I read in the second half of the year. But, you know, these are my favourite books, so I might talk about them a little bit too long. So the first one that I read in January last year was Winter by Ali Smith. I did really love this book just for itself, but I will say as a bit of a caveat, I think I enjoyed it even more because I'm really loving what Ali Smith is doing with her Seasons Quartet, and I liked this as a continuation on From Autumn, which she released the year before. They are standalone stories and you don't have to read them as a series at all, but I think that's what affected my reading experience of this book. So what she's looking at in Winter is kind of the post-truth situation. All the topics that she covers are extremely current. Autumn was about Brexit, but that's not overtly the plot of the book. Ostensibly what this book is about is a man who's going back to visit his mum for Christmas. He's just broken up with his girlfriend, so he pays a stranger on the street to pretend to be his girlfriend and come back and see his mum. And at the same time, his aunt, who's been a bit estranged from his mum, comes back as well. So then they have this sort of weird, awkward family dinner all together. It is quite an abstract book. I don't want to say it's magical realism, but there are some kind of odd scenes. And if you're not used to Ali Smith's writing, this might throw you a little bit. But it's less about the plot and what's actually going on and more about the overarching themes, some of them which are quite explicit, some which are quite specific, and some which are more vague. So she's looking at environmentalism. She also looks at art and the importance of veracity in art, I think, and the idea of buildings and objects and what they mean to us throughout the year. Like, there's so many themes. I'm sure I've forgotten some of them as well, but I do remember that I really enjoyed it. Next, a book that I absolutely raved about when I first read it. I do still like it and I do still love it. I think my love has waned slightly over time, but probably only because it was unrealistic for me to keep that level of excitement about a book over the course of a year. That is 3 Things About Elsie by Joanna Cannon, and I'm including it in this roundup because I have been recommending it to all of my friends all over summer. I've been putting it in everyone's hands, so I think, you know, this was one of my favourites. This is just a very cosy, very nice read, which makes it sound boring, but it has so much heart, and I did find it quite emotional when I was reading it myself. This is about an old lady called Florence who is kind of telling you the story of her life, and she's trying to unpick something that happened in her past, kind of together with her friend Elsie. And there's a few things going on because Florence has dementia, so you can see, and it's quite obvious to you as a reader, that some things Florence isn't telling you, or some things Florence has forgotten herself. But also there are some things which you can't see because Florence has forgotten them, or she's choosing to hide them from you. You're kind of piecing it together with her, but from a different angle. So I wouldn't say it's a mystery. There's not kind of a massive twist in it. But you are trying to work out what's going on with everybody in this old people's home and the kind of event which happened in her past as well. But you're sort of coming from it as a reader from a different angle than Florence is coming at it, and that's what I really liked. And it's also just about the little things that we can do to other people and how small gestures might make a really big impact in someone else's life. Like, it's just really heartfelt. Yeah, I think I'd still recommend it. Next we have Ghost Wall by Sarah Moss, which while I was reading it, I don't think I really enjoyed it, which is an odd thing to say, but it's only after I finished it or in the last few pages I thought, wow, like, this is actually amazing. This follows a young girl called Sylvie whose father is very, very interested, to the point of obsession, of the idea of the true British people and the Britons who were here before the Romans even invaded. So I guess kind of Iron Age Celtic. And he's taken her and her mother along to this experiment which is being conducted by a group of university students, and they're trying to live as Iron Age settlers for a number of weeks, and they've come and joined along. And so what she's looking at is the idea of maybe not nationalism, but the idea of national identity and how far back you can really take it and who the true British people are. But it's not in a really kind of overt sense, which I really enjoyed, and it felt very current, even though it's set in, I think, the 70s or the 80s. And obviously they're looking back even further than that. But it's not just about identity, it's about power and abuse of power, and how kind of abuse can happen within relationships and families, and it be quite subtle to the point where it builds, kind of to the point where it becomes unacceptable, and how you might not see that kind of earlier on. There's so much packed in such a small book, which is why I think it took me till the end of the book to really see what she'd done and be like, wow. And lastly, another book I loved when it feels like the whole world has loved, and I'm really pleased that it's doing very well, and that is Normal People by Sally Rooney. Now, I'm conscious about not raving about this book too much, because I think it's had so much hype. It was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. Actually, was it it was longlisted, maybe not shortlisted. And it did win the Costa book, fiction, I was going to say Book of the Year. Maybe it will win Book of the Year, we don't know. But it did win the Costa Fiction Prize for last year. And I just think it's been everywhere. Everyone has been raving about it, like in all of the newspapers, and I worry that someone's going to pick this book up and think it's going to be something that it's not. There's no big twist, there's no big surprise, the plot isn't really about very much, but what is amazing here is her powers of perception and how good her actual writing is. So this is about two young people, Connell and Marianne, who grew up together in the same town in Ireland. They end up going to the same university, and it's about how their relationship changes, how it waxes and wanes, how it's difficult because they're both from different classes, and how that affects their lives and affects their relationship. And what she does incredibly well is really highlight how different people see the same situation. She can have something happen, and Marianne and Connell have completely different, but I guess completely valid ways of perceiving how that situation played out, and it's how they interpret and misinterpret each other. And it really reminded me of the kind of relationships I had when I was kind of that age, or like at university, of things being very intense and then being very distant. I just want people to be prepared that it's about a relationship, and it's, you know, that's what it's about. It's not the plot that people are loving, I think it's the writing, but it's still up there. It's still one of my favourite books of last year. Then from a very fiction-focused first half of the year, it looks like my favourite books from the second half were mostly non-fiction actually, or quite kind of intense books. So I don't know what happened in June, which made me really change my reading habits. So my first fave from the second half of the year was Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Rennie Edo-Lodge. This book came from, well, the idea from this book came from a blog post that Rennie did years ago with the same title, and it had a massive response. And then she's expanded that idea, I guess, and she's done some research into the history of racism and things in the UK. And what I absolutely loved about reading this book is that when you hear discussions on race and racism, I think a lot of the conversation in the media is very focused on the US, even in the UK, because we're all English speaking. I think that's where a lot of the literature comes from, and especially even in our history lessons and what we get taught in school when we learn about the civil rights movement, we learn about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. We don't learn about kind of anything that happened in the UK. So it's really great to read a book from a UK perspective and looking at all the stuff that Britain was doing in the world and also at home. So I guess this is a book of two halves. She looks at kind of the history of what Britain was doing colonially in like the Caribbean and in Africa and in India, and she looks at our relationships within those countries, and then also how that was then linked to immigration after the First World War, after the Second World War, from those countries to the UK. And she gives a bit of a potted history lesson, not just of non-white people's contribution to the UK, but then also the history of racism and the first kind of anti-racist groups which were set up in the UK, and the civil rights movement in the UK. Which is really just, it makes you angry that you weren't taught this in school. That's how I felt. Like, it gives you so much more context for the state of Britain at the moment. And then the second side of it is looking a little bit more anecdotally about what it's like to grow up as a non-white person in Britain today, and how she feels like she's coming up against a brick wall really when she's trying to talk about racism, because white people in Britain don't want to talk about it, and they feel very awkward talking about racism, and they just think, oh well, I'm not racist, and it's fine. And she's having her words and her experiences shut down. So it's a very important read, very interesting read, and very well written, like really easy to read, I found as well. So I think everyone should pick this up. Next we have a feminist orchestra read. I actually have 2 picks for the feminist orchestra this year in this top 10. So that's great. That means we were picking very well in the second half of the year. And that was Trainwreck by Sadie Doyle. Oh, I will leave information on the feminist orchestra if you're not a member. That's a little book club run by me and Jean, and I'll put it in the description box below. You can join us on Goodreads and be part part of the reading discussions, and you can just watch our videos where we discuss about the books every other month. So this was a pick, I think, in autumn, and what Sadie Doyle is doing in this book is looking at the idea, the concept of the female train wreck. So I think the most obvious example of this would be someone like Britney Spears, someone like Amy Winehouse, and why the media loves the idea of a young, talented, brilliant girl who's got it all going for her, and then she just ruins herself, and she gets drunk, and she gets addicted to drugs, and then she dies very young. And it's like this idea which we're all kind of aware of, but she really focuses in on it and looks at what is the definition of a train wreck. And really it's a woman who is doing too much. Like she's too needy, she's too aggressive, she's too she's addicted to things, she's too sexual, whatever it is. And the idea of hating and fearing this woman stepping out of line. And she looks back at so many examples as well, which I think really made it really interesting. She looks at Mary Wollstonecraft, Charlotte Bronte, Billie Holiday, Sylvia Plath, and even Hillary Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, and kind of how women are portrayed in the media. Men and women doing the same things and behaving in the same way are treated by the media like very, very differently. And I liked that she's focusing in on a very specific subject. Sometimes when she was looking back at historical examples, it went a little bit off-piste, I think. But overall, she's looking at what is a modern phenomenon because of the paparazzi and the media that we have now. But she's also saying this is something that has existed for years, for generations, and she's putting it in wider context. And I liked reading a book, like a feminist book, which was about a really specific topic. So since I started with the Feminist Orchestra pick, I'm going to go with my second one now as well, which was Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. And we read this in November and December, and I absolutely loved it. This is a science fiction / historical novel, I suppose, and it's about a woman called Dana who suddenly finds herself going back in time to 19th century Maryland. And what she eventually works out is that she's being called back, and the young boy that she meets there is actually one of her ancestors. So she's travelling back in time, and time is passing in Maryland each time she travels back, and then she finds out that this young boy and his family are plantation owners, and she is a black woman travelling back in time to kind of slave era Maryland, and she's having to navigate that, but at the same time keep this young boy alive because she's realised that he's one of her ancestors and he needs to like father her grandmother so that she can still exist. So it's very interesting, her relationship with him and the rest of the slaves. And what I found so like urgent in this book, and it really brought home kind of the horrors of it, is that Dana wasn't brought up in this landscape, so she has no idea how to navigate it. She doesn't have any of the tools, she doesn't know how she should behave. So not only is she vulnerable because she's a black woman, but she's also vulnerable because she doesn't understand society, and there's a very real threat of violence like at every turn. She has no kind of political protection at all, and I think that's a really clever, interesting way of you feeling the empathy of these people in this situation through the lens of Dana and through her perception as someone from the modern day. So I absolutely raced through it and would really recommend it. And finally, I think this is my top book of the year. I'm gonna throw my gauntlet down. That's it. This is my favourite book that I read last year. I've saved it till last, and that is Delusions of Gender by Cordelia Fine. Now, I have read a lot of books about feminism, about sexism. I find gender studies, that kind of thing, very interesting. I've read a lot of stuff about that. And a lot of books that you read are very anecdotal. They're looking at society. They're quite philosophical, theoretical. They're talking about why society is the way it is, like how we could change it. And what Cordelia Fine is doing is looking at science. And that's what I really loved about this book. It's very different because you do get increasingly studies, books like Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, or whatever it is, and they come out with this idea that men and women's brains are just different. That there's sexism or inequality or difference, however you want to look at it, because of science, because of biology. Brains are different, that's it. It's hardwired, you can't change it. And Cordelia Fine's gone, that's interesting. So it's interesting that all these male scientists for years and years have looked at women's brains and thought, that brain is a perfect brain for doing laundry. And she's just gone through it all, and it's so thorough, and I can't even explain how good this book is because I would just be reading it back to you. But she's looking at all these studies which have been done with male and female babies. She's looking at the differences in brain studies that have been done, and studies that have been done on different marsupials and different animals, looking for gender difference. And she kind of goes through all of these studies, and she's looking at, yes, but from this data, how can you tell me that men and women are different from this exact data necessarily? And yes, some of them have difference, but a lot of them really are about the bias of the scientists conducting the experiments themselves. So it's like a two-pronged attack. She's kind of looking at the actual science and these neuroscientific studies that have been done, and she's also looking at how, you know, babies are socialised, how the scientists are interacting with different babies if they know what gender the baby is. And she's not saying that gender is wrong or gender doesn't exist or there's no differences between the sexes at all, but she's saying that there's very, very little evidence. Like, a lot of the evidence that we do have is so slight, and they don't publish studies which show no difference because that wouldn't be interesting. They only publish stuff which shows a slight bit of difference, and then everyone starts talking about it. And she's trying to kind of strip all that away and say there actually is very, very little evidence that differences in the way brains work then mean that there's a difference in the actual mind. I'm sure I've done a very poor job of explaining how good this book is, because she's so clever. She's gone, and it's so well referenced as well. Like, half of this book at the back is referenced. Like, she's so thorough. She goes through so many different things, and it's also so readable. Like, I'm not a neuroscientist. I don't know a lot of these terms for different parts of the brain, but she makes it so, like, she really takes you along on her journey. She makes it so easy to understand, and she's very funny as well. She's quite self-deprecating at points, and honestly, I think everyone should read this. Everyone. So that's my faves. Those are my faves. I read some good ones. I think I didn't read that much this year. I had quite a lot of personal stuff going on, so I didn't read as much as I really wanted to. But the ones I read, I'm quite happy with that. I would love to hear from you what your favourite books are that you read this year. I'd also love to hear if you've read any of these, if you have any opinions on them, good or bad, actually. I always find it quite interesting when someone else loves a book that I don't particularly like, or vice versa. So I'd love to have another chat with you in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Bye.